Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan Little. Today we're going to be discussing leading. Now leading is when you bet into the aggressor on the previous betting round. Alright, I don't incorporate leading into my game. I always simply check and then respond in a balanced fashion to what the aggressor does. Which, is really perfectly fine. If you told me you never led into the pre-flop raiser, I don't think it's that big of a deal. That said, developing a leading strategy in some spots does make sense and will increase your equity some. Not a lot, but some. And this is always the debate, is whether or not you should actually add these strategies to your game if they are much more difficult to implement. A good example of this is, say you have a 25 big blind stack, or let's say you have a 12 big blind stack or a 15 big blind stack. In that scenario, most people either shove or fold, right? But if you implement a limping and or min raise to your range with some portion of it, while you're still jamming some, you're still folding some, and now you're min raising some, that will make you more money. It definitely will. It's been proven it will. But it's very hard to implement. Next, and that's often the strategy you see the best players in the world doing, by the way. They are min raising some, jamming some, and folding some. Some, though, will also limp instead of min raising. Next, though, you could also develop a shove, fold, min raise, and limp strategy. So now you have 4 options pre-flop. Doing that will add a tiny, tiny bit more money. A teensy bit. So let's say the push fold strategy wins, let's say 1 big blind per 100 hands. The push min raise fold strategy wins 1.4 big blinds per hand. The push min raise fold limp strategy wins 1.42 big blinds per 100 hands. So like just a tiny bit more. Is it worth it to try to figure out that significantly much more complicated strategy? I don't even know. I'm so bad at English. That's a much more difficult strategy to implement. So is it better to do that? And the answer is probably not. And in terms of leading is something that will add a little bit to your game. But first off, the reasonable spots to lead don't come up very often. And therefore, it's just not a common thing. And then also, the range you should be leading often is not that big. So say you have the opportunity to lead on specific boards. There really are only specific boards you want to be leading. Say you could lead on these specific boards, 20% of the time. And then you're supposed to lead with, let's say, 20% of hands, those 20% of the time. So that means, 4% of the time you have a leading opportunity. So 4% of the time you can increase your equity by a tiny bit. So is that worth actually focusing on? It's close. 4% of the time is a real number. It's not like that's nothing. But at the same time, I don't think it's something that's like humongously, vitally important. So in terms of things you need to develop, I think a leading range is a relevant thing on the list, but certainly not near the top. Like you need to learn when to continuation bet way more than you need to learn when to lead. So anyway, when should you think about leading in these various spots? How do you balance this with your checking range? Should you ever lead the turn or the river? And are there differences when you should lead the turn, flop, turn, and river? All right, so first things first, when should we think about leading? The main time is when the board is good for your range and bad for your opponent's range. And you usually want to be leading when you have a premium made hand that is susceptible to being outdrawn or a junky draw that cannot check call. And this often occurs when you defend the big blind against an earlier middle position raiser. So, for example, say under the gun raises, you call, flop comes 8 of diamonds, 7 of diamonds, 6 of spades. So to determine who has the range advantage, you run your entire range. Here I have our entire range. Queens to twos, which you probably 3-bet queens, but whatever. Ace 9 suited to ace 2 suited, king jack suited to king 5 suited. It's a very long range of a lot of marginal stuff. And then our opponent, raising in early position, has 6s or better, ace 10 suited or better, king jack suited or better. The best suited connectors, ace jack offsuit and better, and king jack offsuit and better. So there's good hands. And you see if you run that range against our range, we have 50% equity, which is actually very good. If you were to instead run this on ace king 3, you'd see that we have, 30% equity or something like that. We would be in awful shape. So in this scenario, when we have 50% equity, usually when you have about 50% equity or more, maybe 48% equity or more, that's a pretty decent spot to consider leading with a polarized range. And that polarized range are hands that are very good, where if you bet and get called, you're just happy about that, and junky draws. So on 8-7-6, with a flush draw, what are the hands that are susceptible to being outdrawn but are still pretty good? That's going to be sets and two pairs pretty much entirely. You may ask, what about a straight? Well, a straight isn't that susceptible to being outdrawn, right? I understand there is a flush draw available, but if you think about the opponent's range, they only have ace, king to ace 10 suited, king jack suited, king queen suited, queen jack suited, jack 10 suited, 10 9 suited. So there really aren't very many combinations of flush draws out of their entire range, right? So we're not really worried about the flush draw, which means we're essentially immune to getting outdrawn when we have a straight. But say we have 8-7 in this scenario, our opponent very easily could have pocket aces, and pocket aces has, well, 2 outs to the set, 3 outs to better 2 pair, and then backdoor 2 pairs, right? And the turn could get really bad to the point where we just don't get to put a whole lot of money in the pot. Also, on this board, in this scenario, the opponent should be doing a lot of checking behind. So we want to be betting with 8-7 because the opponent is going to see a free card a large portion of the time. So typically the boards you're going to want to lead on are the middle card boards and some of the really connected low card boards. So I would lead with the 2 pairs and better. Well, 2 pairs and sets. Then I would also lead with junky draws. So what are junky draws here that can't really check call and also may not want to check raise? Well, a hand like King 5 or King 4 or King 10. These are all hands that don't really want to check call but they do have some equity, right? They have gut shots or bad open-ended straight draws with an overcard. I mean, that is a hand that has some equity. And leading with that makes a lot of sense. You could consider leading with junky flush draws, but flush draws can often check call. I suppose if you had something like Jack 3 of diamonds, maybe that's a hand you would want to lead because it's a really bad flush draw. But if you think about all the flush draws, a lot of them are going to have a gut shot to go along with them. So they're not really that bad, and they can either check call or check raise. But again, we're trying to add some bluffs to our leading range. So the ones you want to first look at and consider are the junky draws. This is very different than what a lot of people do, by the way. A lot of people will lead with their marginal made hands, and when they lead with marginal made hands, what happens is their opponents always call with better hands, so they're in bad shape then, and they always fold out stuff that is decently far behind. So a lot of recreational players lead with their marginal made hands for protection because they're afraid of getting outdrawn, but that is essentially never a good option here. However, it's often best to only have a checking range. Leading the flop quickly splits your range, making it difficult for you to remain balanced. That's really the issue, right? If you lead with your best made hands in your draws, at least most of your best made hands and some of your junky draws, then what does that do to your checking range? Well, it takes those good hands out of your checking range, and you really want to have good hands in your checking range. If your checking range now becomes only straights and then top pair and worse, you just don't have very many good hands in your range anymore, and that allows your opponent to just go bet, 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 because even though you should have the polarization advantage normally, because you have all the 2 pairs, you don't because you checked. If most people lead with only marginal made hands, don't others expect that, thus meaning it might not split your range in their minds? That's an interesting question. I mean, if they expect you to have marginal made hands and you're instead leading very polarized, then they're going to play poorly against that. So you're essentially playing a counter strategy to what they are expecting, which is fine. And you're also playing a much more game theory optimal strategy in general, which is also fine. If they think you're going to have marginal made hands, you want to figure out how they're going to react to that. If they're going to be doing a lot of raising or floating and then raising the turn, well, now you probably just don't want to lead with your garbage, right? You only want to lead with your best hands. So that's relevant. If they're just going to fold out all their overcards and all their junky draws and just muck, well, then you don't want to lead with your best hands. You want to lead with only bluffs. So if you actually have an idea of how they're going to react to the lead, then you're much better off doing whatever makes the most sense. And right here, right, if your opponent plays poorly in a predictable manner, let's say they always raise you, then clearly you just need to lead with your best hands, right? And if they always fold or very often fold, well, then you want to lead with a lot of bluffs. And maybe not even the gut shots, maybe just stone bluffs because they're going to fold too often. All right, so is it different heads up versus multi-way? So I would generally say to be more inclined to lead multi-way because the preflop raiser is less likely to make a blind continuation bet. I mean, you see this all the time, right? Say you raise under the gun and you know you're going to continuation bet on almost all boards, but it comes 9-7-4, but you're 3 or 4 ways. Well, now you're just not going to bet with king queen on 9-7-4. You're just going to check fold, right? So whereas if it was heads up, you may make a continuation bet. So multi-way, you need to be more inclined to lead. And usually, again, you want to be leading with the best made hands and draws. But now leading with just good made hands like top pairs or weak over pairs becomes more viable because you don't mind the protection nearly as much. Like say you do have ace 9 on 9-7-4 against one player, you're either way ahead or way behind, right? And if you are way ahead, you're not really that susceptible to being outdrawn because your opponent has 6 outs. But say you're very multi-way, say you're 3 or 4 or 5 ways and it comes 9-7-4. Now, if they all have overcards, well, right, you're against all sorts of outs, right? You just aren't going to win that often. So leading then becomes viable for protection. And when you do lead for protection, it's often with the idea that you're going to be folding if you get raised because you don't expect your opponents to get too out of line. Now, you may lead into a field of players who maybe 2 out of the 3 you think are going to be very straightforward, and then you're going to fold if they raise, but then one of them is maniacal, and you're not going to fold if that one raises. That is something that comes up very, very often. It's certainly possible for you to bet with the intention of continuing against some players and not continuing against other players. So don't think that you have to always be bet folding or always be bet calling, because that's certainly not a good strategy. I mean, a very obvious example of this that comes up a lot in live tournaments is say you have 15 or 20 big blinds and you have something like pocket 7s under the gun. That's a spot where the game theory optimal play is often just to jam all in because it's a hand that doesn't mind getting your opponents to fold. But if you're at a table with 5 tight players and 4 maniacs, you can min raise with the 7s and fold if a tight player shoves because their range is going to be like 10s or better in ace king. And you can call if one of the maniacs shove because their range is going to be ace x, right? So in that scenario, you are raising with the idea that I'm going to call some of these people and fold to some of these other people. And that's a very similar example that comes up a lot, but this one's similar but doesn't come up nearly as often. So say you did have ace 9 on 9-7-4, you should probably lead in that scenario unless you're against an initial preflop raiser who you think is very, very tight. Also notice with ace 9 on 9-7-4, you can get called by a lot of worse stuff, right? Whereas if you have a hand instead like 7-6 on 9-7-4, you probably don't want to be leading, and you may actually just want to check fold. Because if you lead with 7-6 on 9-7-4, you're going to get called by almost entirely better hands or draws. But if you lead with ace 9, you can get called by worse made hands and draws. So you're extracting value, right? And I would probably lead there with something like queen 9 or better. I think that seems reasonable. I mean, but again, notice if I'm leading queen 9 or better, it's not actually that many. It's not that many value hands, right? And the draws I'm going to lead are going to be stuff like Jack 8 for a gut shot and an overcard. Mano says, when it's multi-way, isn't it more likely that someone has something? Yes, but think about 9-7-4, right? I mean, like, what is something on 9-7-4? I mean, if someone's saying they were 10-9, they're going to think it's a pretty good hand and they're not folding. There aren't very many sets available, right? I mean, you block top pair, so they're not going to have that. So you're really only worried about overpairs specifically, overpairs and sporadic sets. So in that scenario, there really aren't that many hands the opponents can have. That's very different than something like, let's say 10-9-8, right? On 10-9-8, you don't want to lead with ace 10 because there you actually very easily could be beat. So it depends a lot on the board. It's not just as easy as multi-way someone has something so I should not lead, because some boards connect way better than with your opponent's ranges than others. Like on 10-9-8, you really don't want to be putting a whole lot of money in the pot at all with much of anything, just because it's so easy for someone there to have the straights or 2 pairs or sets. But on 9-7-4, when you have a 9 in your hand, now it's difficult for them to have a better hand. You say, but they can call. Of course they're going to call, but we're value betting with our ace 9, right? We don't mind if they call with 10-9 because we're crushing them. We don't mind if they call with 7-6 because we're crushing them. And you can do a lot of leading on the flop with the idea that you're going to then check the turn. Or, you can keep betting if the turn's another low card. You can continue betting a relatively small size for value. But when you bet with ace 9, you're not trying to make everyone fold, right? You're trying to get value and make hands that have equity fold. I mean, it works out amazingly well because your opponents are going to respond almost exactly as you want them to. Because if they have a hand like king queen, they're just going to fold. And king queen had lots of equity, so that's fine. And if they have a hand like 7-6 or 10-9, they're going to call, and those hands are drawing almost dead. So it works out great. And yes, you're going to be out of position, but you have top pair, top kicker. I mean, it's fine. That's a good hand. You don't mind playing top pair, top kicker out of position. which is why you don't want to lead hands like 7-6, because when you bet and get called, you're often in bad shape, and now you're out of position with a hand that's often in bad shape. That's very susceptible to just being blown off, right? But with ace nine, you're not folding. You're not check folding the turn ever, and you're probably not check folding the river ever. If you bet the flop on 9-7-4 with ace nine, and someone calls and it turns a king, and you check and they bet, you should not fold, because like how does a king connect with their range at all? It pretty much doesn't, right? Unless they have exactly king 9 or king 7 suited. So the king is essentially a blank. Same thing for a queen. Same things for a 10, right? These are just, they're not that scary of cards, because if they have king 9, they also have queen 9, jack 9, 10 9, all those hands in their range that you're crushing. And if you check the turn, they may decide to value bet with that hand or bet it for protection, because they're now going to put you on a lot of draws and worse made hands. So it's going to work out very well for you just to check and then check call. If it does go check on the turn, you can either bet or check the river. It depends on how often your opponent calls donk bets, right? And also you can ask like which cards really connect with the opponent's draws. And on 9-7-4, the cards that connect with draws are a jack, a 10, an 8, or 6, right? Those are ones that very clearly connect with the draws. And on those, you would just check. I mean, like I said, you're going to be doing a lot of checking on the turn, and that's okay. Because on the flop, you bet, you got your protection from the overcards, you kept the worst made hands in, and now you're against the range of made hands for the most part and decent draws. So you check call. And sometimes you're going to lose. It's okay to lose. Understand you're going to lose the pot sometimes. All right, next. How do you balance with, leading with your checking range? Well, this is the difficult part, right? If you only lead with a polarized range, it severely caps your checking range, right? And this is fine if your opponents are oblivious, but most of them are not, which is why you very often don't want to do a whole lot of leading. You just don't want to do it. It's not going to work out well in general. But I mean, these two examples I've given so far, the heads up example on 8-7-6 and this example with 9-7 or 9-7-4, whatever it was, I'm leading in both of those spots the majority of the time because I know these are good spots and I know how to play those spots very well. But again, those spots just don't come up very often. So it may be 2% of the time when you defend in the big blind. So if you defend in the big blind or the small blind, let's say it's well, I guess you're only in the big blind maybe 12% of the time. So if you defend, let's say 8% of the time, 8% of the time, you can get one of those 20% flops. And then 20% of those times, you're going to have a leading spot. So it's 4% of 8%, whatever that is. It's not a lot, right? 4% of 8% is almost nothing. Okay. So if your opponents are bad, they don't care what you're doing, and they're just going to play very poorly against you, then feel free to continue leading. But again, I just don't think it's such a good strategy. All right. Should you ever lead the turn or the river? The answer is sure. You want to do it when the turn and river changes the range advantage. And that is very often going to be when lots of draws come in. But realize, again, not all these draws are created equally. So, same scenario as before, leading with a linear range is often ideal, but again, some people leading very linearly may be ideal. So let's take a look at these two examples. The one on the left has the same board, 8-7-6, against the early position range, turns a 3 of diamonds. So say we check called flop, or this would actually be a scenario if we checked flop. So it goes check on the flop. Do we want to bet the turn? The answer is definitely yes, right? And the reason I say this is check flop, because notice both players' ranges are still 100%, right? The ranges have not changed between the first example and this example. So that means it went check on the flop, as it often will on 8-7-6 if your opponent's good. On a 3 of diamonds turn, now notice that the out-of-position player has 55%, so you should be betting a lot. I mean, when your range starts getting up to like 55% or more, you can be betting with essentially your whole range, and you can start kind of blasting it. And in this scenario, if you do have a 7 or a 6, you don't really mind betting for protection, and also it puts your opponent's entire range has essentially become bluff catchers. And when that's the case, you can get away with bluffing a lot. What about another... well, probably the best card for you, 10 of diamonds. 10 of diamonds bumps you up to a whopping 68% equity, right? And in this scenario, you should be betting almost certainly with everything. So these are times where you definitely want to be betting. But notice this isn't exactly leading, right? This is more where it goes check on the flop. If you check call the flop, what does that do to your range? Think about this, right? Let's say you check the flop, the opponent bets with 100% of their hands. You call with only the draws, made hands, etc., right? So all of your garbage goes away. What does that do to your range and to your opponent's range? Well, if your opponent bets 100%, their range stays the same, right? Because they bet with everything. Your range, though, loses all of its garbage. So if all of your garbage goes away and the draws come in, that means your equity in these spots would actually be higher because you're missing all of your total garbage. So you're not sitting in here with Queen Jack of Hearts anymore, right? It's no longer there. So that's not a potential bluffing hand. Queen 10 of Hearts is probably gone. Maybe you call Queen 10 of Hearts. Really, there's not a whole lot of garbage, but the garbage that does exist will go away. Like Ace 2 of Hearts, Ace 3 of Hearts, right? Ace 4 of Hearts probably isn't in there anymore. So all of those hands are just gone. And when we get this turn, our equity is going to be even bigger. So this is certainly a spot to be leading. Again, mostly polarized with good made hands and draws. And funny enough, your flushes are often very susceptible to being outdrawn, in which case you want to lead with them. Maybe, you know what? Maybe I did Okay, I'm sorry. I did actually go through this. In this scenario, our range did get narrowed on the flop because I see we're missing ace 4, 3, and 2, which that's weird. Why would we not have ace 4, 3, 2 suited? Because this is a spot where I did assume our opponent bet 100%, we called. So this is about as good as it's going to be. I apologize. Anyway, you can go through these scenarios and edit the ranges as if you checked your opponent bet and you called. And that's going to give you ideas of who has the range advantage in these spots. So if you do check call the flop, this is what our equity looks like on these obviously scary turns. And these become reasonable spots to lead. Especially the 10 of diamonds, especially 9 of diamonds, especially 5 of diamonds, 4 of diamonds. Those are all going to be very good cards for the check caller. You may say if you may be aware that if you check raise the diamonds on the flop, well then these turns are going to be way worse for you. So make sure this is actually a good representation of your range. And this is a board where you should be check raising a lot. So these numbers may not be accurate, but this is why it's important for you to study away from the table and figure out exactly how you play these spots and see if these cards are good or bad for you. Jim says, any board pair on the turn would be good to bet or check raise. Correct. Also, yeah, I think so. They'd be fine. Really all of these on 8-7-6, just because the preflop raiser has almost no 8s, 7s, or 6s, right? If you look at their range. So that's another spot where you can put them in a very bad spot. Also, just like any 10, 9, 5, or 4 is going to be fine enough. Not amazing, not great, but fine. So you should consider leading those two. But the straight and flush cards are usually the absolute best ones. All right, differences on each betting round. Really, there are not very many differences. Leading becomes viable when you have the range advantage. It's as simple as that. It really is. You don't need to overcomplicate it. A very clear spot where people like leading, by the way, is when the middle or bottom card pairs. So say big blind, or someone raises, you call, big blind, flop comes, whatever, Jack 7, 3. If you check, they bet. Very often people don't bet with their whole range here, which means their checking range is a lot of their marginal stuff. Their marginal stuff is going to be some jacks, a lot of 7s, and some marginal pairs and some garbage. Okay? So when they go check, and a 7 comes on the turn, that's very good for the flop checker. But what does that mean whenever they bet? Well, if they bet the flop, it means they don't have their 7s, and you're always check calling with your 7s, right? Because you're not check raising 8-7 on Jack 7-3. So you check call. When the turn is a 7, that becomes a great spot to lead with your 7s and also with some bluffs. And if you're check calling with gut shots or maybe overcards with backdoor flush draws or something like that, that's a very nice spot to lead. Because then you're very polarized, right? You have the best made hands, you have the 7s, and then you also have some garbage that doesn't have another great way to play. Also, your opponent's going to check behind on the 7 a lot on the turn if you check, because if they're good, they understand that you have lots of 7s and they don't. So that makes a lot of their hands marginal made. Tim says, can you walk through how to think about the river when you lead the turn and opponent calls? Well, in that scenario, you are often polarized, right? So if you're polarized, you want to be betting with a balanced game theory optimal range on the river, assuming you are trying to be game theory optimal. And that's going to be where you are betting with some proportion of premium made hands to draws, usually 2 premium hands to 1 bluff when you're potting it. It becomes the typical polarized river situation. You can read about that in Mastering Small Snakes No Limit Hold'em in the river section, because that's a little bit too much to get into because we're running out of time for this specific strategy session. But you want to make a bet such that your opponent is indifferent between calling and folding, and when you do that, you win the pot. So if your range on the river is 2 value hands to 1 bluffs, and you pot it, your opponent needs to win 66, or they would need to win 33% of the time. They are going to win exactly 33% of the time because you have 1/3 bluffs in your range, and that's it. You will have to give up with some of your bluffs because you may have too many bluffs, but also realize some of your bluffs will very likely have turned into premium made hands on the river, so that's pretty nice for you as well. Notice this is very different if you're leading the turn with a marginal made hand, because then on the river, if you bet again with marginal made hand, sometimes you lose, and that really complicates things, because if your value range loses to your opponent a lot of the time, that's not good, which is another reason you don't want to be doing that. Benno says, what about the other side? How should we react to leads when... Well, that's just like the last example I gave on Jack 7-3-7. In that scenario, you just have to call with your best made hands, right? Understand which rivers are good for you and which rivers are bad for you. On Jack 7-3-7, bad rivers are obviously 10, 9, or 8, right? Because those complete the most likely gut shots. So if you're sitting here with like Ace-Jack, you may consider folding, but really Ace-Jack is probably just too good to fold. At that point, you really want to start calling based on the minimum defense frequency. And in that spot, if they pot it on the river, you need to call with half of your range, right? So if you need to call with half of your range, then what's the top half of your range? Obviously, Ace-Jack is going to be in there. Hands like pocket 10s may not be such a good call on the river because those block 10-9 and 10-8, which means your opponent's more likely to have a value hand. Whereas a hand like pocket 2s may be a very good call on the river because it doesn't block any of the open-ended straight draws or any of the gut shots. So in that scenario, when you are calling on the river, blockers are very important if your opponent's actually good. If your opponent's not good and they're just betting around with who knows what, then you don't necessarily know if you need to be blocking the 10-9 because your opponent could just be leading with king, queen, or something like that. But anyway, the question of how to react to leads. In general, figure out what your opponents are doing wrong and then play accordingly. And that really is the answer to most of these scenarios because the vast majority of people lead with ranges that are very transparent and very exploitable, right? If, like, for example, they're only leading with marginal made hands, then your strategy is easy. If they're only leading with the nuts, well, then you just fold everything, right? So if they make life easy on you, then it's great. If not, often you need to rely on minimum defense frequency and just solid game theory strategies, which is what you should do against every player, right? If you know what they're doing wrong, exploit them. And if you don't know what they're doing wrong, or if they're just playing great, play game theory optimal.